This is the Weather Lounge here at WeatherWorks.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Weather Lounge. I'm your host, meteorologist Mike Mahalik, and it's time to kick back, relax, and talk about the weather. In particular, winter weather and the potential for more cold and snowstorms later in February and into March. Now, while I could sit here and talk all about the upcoming pattern, we thought it would be best if we bring in a member of our long range team here at WeatherWorks, and that is meteorologist Kyle Leahy. Kyle, welcome to the Weather Lounge.
Hey, Mike, it's always good to be here.
Yeah, don't sound too excited,
Yeah.
Kyle. Now, come on.
Eh,
We're talking about cold and snow. Are you ready to talk about those things in discussion?
yeah, I mean, we haven't really in like probably 3 weeks. So, and probably for the next, I'd say like five days, it's gonna be super quiet. So,
Right. Well, before we get into the outlook, Kyle, I want to take a quick break. And then on the other side of the break, we're going to answer all of your big storm questions coming up here for the second half of winter. And it looks like it's going to be quite favored for some more snow. So please don't go away. Welcome back to the Weather Lounge. I'm meteorologist Mike Mahalik, and I'm here with long range meteorologist Kyle Leahy. And Kyle, before we get started, I know you aren't alone working on all of these long range outlooks from the winter all through summer. So let's give a quick shout out to who's helping you out on these.
yeah, no, it's Kevin Winters. Yeah, he's definitely a big help, for sure. He's a smart dude. He definitely knows what he's talking about. So it's really nice to be able to work with him on this stuff.
Yeah, it's nice that you guys team up on this and that you could kind of keep each other in check and not one person getting too crazy with going, "Oh my gosh, it's going to
Yeah,
be,
yeah,
big blizzards," and on the other end, "Wait, let's hold up a bit because we got a
yeah, yeah.
couple of things we got to look at from." So it's nice that you guys can collaborate on that
Hmm.
and come out with some really excellent long range outlooks. So anyway, so let's get started here, Kyle, with what's going to happen for the rest of the season here in winter. But before we
Hmm.
do that, I want to talk a little bit about what happened in December, why it was on the mild side, and what changed in January. So, if you don't mind, let's go through that for our listeners, and we'll have graphics on our YouTube. This will be a YouTube video too. So, if you want to see those graphics and maps and what Kyle's talking about, visit our YouTube channel at WeatherWorks. Just search for us. Um, but on our podcast, you won't have that benefit, but we'll do our real best to explain all of this for you.
Yeah. So in terms of December, I think it might have been probably I think it was the warmest December on record for the U.S. I could be wrong. If
Yeah.
if it's not, it's very close. But the main reason for that is you have this like massive high pressure system. Sorry, low pressure system over Alaska,
Okay.
and what that does is it pretty much just funnels in all of this air from the Pacific Ocean right into kind of like the northern plains. It's really the only pattern. Yeah, and you get this nice high here, and
Mm,
it's really the only pattern that can make the entire United States warm. Like a lot of the time, if we're warm here, a lot like the Rockies might be really cold. This is an example of just there's no snow anywhere. Like everybody is just roasting. So it's probably the worst pattern that you could have. Yeah.
yeah.
So
So this
yeah,
is what you don't want if you're a
yeah,
snow
yeah.
lover. That's for
Yep.
sure.
Pretty much.
But how did things start changing as we head into January? Because we did see some snowier times and colder times too. As we head into even the later in the first week of January into the mid portion of the month. Excuse me.
Yeah, exactly. So pretty much the issue is that yeah. So when you have that jet extending, luckily, what happens most of the time is that it'll kind of back off a bit,
Hmm.
back into like the Central Pacific, and you're able to get like a nice area of high pressure right over Alaska instead of in like instead of that low pressure, which is really detrimental to everything.
Hmm.
Also, what was going on at the same time was you were getting a lot of weakening of the polar vortex. You might think, oh, you would want a strong polar vortex if you want it to be cold down here,
Mm.
but it's actually the other way around. It's the equivalent of like if you're it's like a spinning top, and it's really stable when it's spinning quickly, which is what the polar vortex usually does. But if the
So
top isn't spinning that fast and it's weaker, it's able to wobble around and get disrupted and spill colder air farther south.
right. So for people at home, well, of course, everybody's at home, right? Or
Yeah.
wherever you are listening to this
Yeah.
podcast or viewing this video. But when it's strong, it keeps that cold air locked up around the pole,
Yep.
correct?
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, that's why you don't want it. And what
Mhm.
Kyle's talking about, once that breaks up, pieces of it can kind of fall into the northern portion of the United States or over into Europe, depending on how it all, you know, shakes out
Yeah.
during that breakup process.
Yep.
Um,
Exactly.
but yeah,
So,
Kyle. So yeah, you talked about how the jet stream kind of pulled back a little
mhm,
bit in January. What's an example of how it looked before that retraction?
yeah. So, yes, I mean, pretty much before that, you really just had like that big low pressure beforehand.
Right,
And
right.
yeah, exactly. So it's kind of what we were dealing with in December. And then when the jet retracts, you're able to get that nice high, replace it. And this kind of black line that we're showing here is instead of the jet stream kind of doing
Mm.
this, one second. Yeah, instead of beforehand where it's kind of just flooding the US more or less,
Right.
you're able to kind of get to something that looks more like this, where you actually end up getting air from the Arctic right up here, and it gets sent back down. So that's why you got that big Arctic outbreak in like the Northwest and the plains.
Yep.
It's pretty much from displacing that polar air, which just it literally just was not possible in December. So this is actually a pattern that's a bit more typical of like a La Nina winter, which is a bit which is was a bit odd when we were
Mm.
seeing it, but these, like every winter's different and you can't really just kind of put one in a box. Like there can be things that look a bit odd, especially with this much blocking. So
Right.
by blocking, I mean just the like this big area of high pressure up in Greenland, which we'll also get to later because that's one of the reasons why February is looking more interesting. Um, it's a bit atypical for how early in the year it was, but
Mhm.
it was definitely like a complete 180 from what we were seeing in December. So,
Yeah, and I think it's an important note that when Kyle and Kevin are making these long range outlooks, they have to look at what's going on across the entire northern hemisphere, to see where these upper level waves are moving across the United States, and where they're crossing Asia, and how it's affecting the entire global pattern,
mhm,
basically.
yeah,
So that's why it gets really difficult when somebody asks you in October, "Hey, we gonna get a big blizzard this year?" Well, there's a lot that goes into it. We can kind of narrow down a time range when it's most favorable, but to
yeah,
give you that exact date, very,
uh,
very difficult to do.
yeah. It's pretty much
But
impossible.
recently we've been a little bit milder, Kyle, but it does look like things will be changing here and pretty soon, also.
Yeah, exactly. So, just quickly going through why we're so mild because it does actually have there's a little bit of a parallel to what happened in December.
Mm,
So, looking at all of this, this is basically just the Pacific jet stream more or less, like this large band of your reds and reds and oranges. So you have this Pacific jet that's pretty much just like cutting right through the southwestern United States, and it's just flooding most of the country with warmth.
mm,
It's again not what you want if you want it to be very snowy. Um, and then if we kind of look a bit closer to home, looking here, this is basically showing what's called an omega block. The reason why it's called an omega block is because if you kind of trace the way the wind is moving, it sort of looks like the Greek letter. You get these two areas of low pressure here, right? You have one near California, which is responsible for all the rain that they're getting,
right.
and then you actually have two. You have one near Florida, and then you have another one near Nova Scotia, and then there's just a large just sprawling high pressure system over southeast Canada, which is the reason why it's so quiet and so dry here. Um, these can kind of stick around for a little while, but luckily we're going to see things break up a little bit once we get, like further. I would honestly say like probably by like the 12th to 15th, it looks.
Right. So we do have this threat around Valentine's Day,
Hmm.
or a little bit before, but that's not quite into the most favorable portion of the late season that we're kind of eyeing up here.
Yep.
So why don't we go into that a little bit more? Although we might get something around early Valentine's Day or just before.
Hmm.
Um, what's more favorable as we head into mid-February and into even early March?
Yeah. So there are really a few things that are going on here that are worth watching. So you again have this pretty nice trough that we were talking about earlier. And then you have this area of low pressure in the northern Atlantic. And if we track that farther in time, you could see if you kind of just trace both of those, you could see how they kind of almost just become one very,
Mm,
very, very strong low pressure system over the North Atlantic. And what that does a lot of the time is it'll basically just bring all of this warm air right into Greenland. You can also see a nice high starting to form near Scandinavia. A lot of the time, what happens with these highs is they end up kind of tracking back or retrograding, which is when instead of systems moving west to east, they actually move east to west, which does happen sometimes. So, just looking towards the Atlantic, if we kind of see what happens there, you could see how you get this really, really, really strong high pressure forming over Greenland, which is commonly referred to as a negative NAO, Northern Atlantic Oscillation. You might see something like that, on like Twitter, social media. That's pretty much
mhm.
what that means when you have a lot of high pressure near Greenland and you have lower pressure kind of more towards, just like the Northern Atlantic. So
Right.
it's a pretty anomalous signal for this range.
And that's the, blocking that we like to see if we're looking for a big East Coast storm.
Yes. Yep. Exactly. I would say out of all of like the main features, so for example, you also have this Alaskan ridge,
Hmm.
um, and the main flow of this pattern, which is why it's quite good, is because if you just follow the flow here, it's pretty much right out of the Arctic, more or less. So you have a nice air feed to tap into. But yeah, as you were mentioning, yeah, that big Greenland high is probably the biggest precursor to like larger East Coast storms. It's like you can get a larger, like you can get like a maybe like a 6 to 8 inch storm with that one, but if you're talking about anything over like a foot, really from New York City southward, Boston can just kind of get larger storms because they have the latitude to do so. But if you're New York City south, especially in the Mid Atlantic, you really need this big high, and it it's a pretty
Hmm.
nice signal that we're seeing.
Right, exactly. And that's one of like you said, that's one of the hallmarks of getting into a good storm pattern
Yeah.
for the East Coast.
Hmm.
I'm not sure how much that does that affect the Midwest having that blocking high there? Are they in the same situation or a little bit different?
So for the Midwest, the reason why El Nino winters are really not very great for the Midwest is because you're really kind of stuck between this big high pressure, this ridge here,
Hmm.
and that low. So a lot of the time, um, this is a pretty suppressive area. You don't really get it. It's really difficult to get very good low pressure forming in this kind of area. It's near impossible, really. So I wouldn't like completely like rule something out because what's interesting about this pattern, one of the other reasons why it's really favorable is because if you kind of follow what the Pacific Jet is doing, you could pretty much visualize the Pacific Jet running along like here, like this way, under this big low.
Hmm.
And then you have this high pressure to the north, and this is what's called split flow. So you pretty much just have a lot of these really moist waves traveling, into the southwestern U.S., and then they can meet up with these kind of drier, but potentially potent, what we call northern stream waves because they're from the polar jet or the north, and they kind of meet up potentially in like the Mississippi River Valley. So it can be quite stormy. But with the Midwest, they're really just kind of limited to just kind of clippers,
Yeah,
basically.
so it looks like they get those weaker disturbances, or
Mhm.
when the southern stream is meeting the northern stream, and then that doesn't really mature until it gets more towards the East Coast.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
it's meeting over the Midwest, and then it matures as it goes off the East Coast and up the eastern seaboard into eastern Canada. So, that's why they're kind of stuck in limbo a little bit
Hmm.
in this sort of pattern.
Yeah.
Um, so, Kyle, I know this is the pattern that we're really keying on, and obviously, like you said, it looks like a good setup for more cold and snow. How
Mhm.
long do you think this pattern is going to last?
Yeah. So what's interesting about this pattern is that I don't think that it's going to be kind of like a one and done like we had to deal with in mid-January, where we did have a pretty strong Greenland high, but it actually transitioned to a vortex probably within just a strong low pressure instead, probably in the span of like a week, which is pretty impressive.
Mm,
But given the fact that, as we were talking about earlier, the polar vortex up in the stratosphere is going to become extremely weak again, and it'll do something called coupling, or just becoming in sync with the really weak polar vortex that we're seeing now, like where we are, or like the troposphere, kind of just like lower in the atmosphere. So when those two are in sync, the stratosphere and the troposphere, that's when you have blocking that's stable and is able to kind of reload a bit more. So I could see blocking really just kind of ebbing and flowing until
mm.
really like the first or second week of March, instead of just being like a week to 10 days.
It always seems to me too that when these really strong blocks happen, these big strong Greenland highs and ridging and stuff like that, it seems once it gets there and it's really strong,
Hmm.
it just takes some time in order for that to break down. It's not something you just kind of get rid of in a week.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so, but you brought up a good point about we always hear the polar vortex in the media, and I don't know if we touched upon this earlier, but um, maybe some people think that, hey, if there's a strong polar vortex, that's good for us, but it's really not. Correct?
Yeah.
It's the opposite.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So this is a pretty good example. This is actually probably a textbook example of like a very weak polar vortex. So just like really across the entire Arctic, you just have a massive high pressure system, more or
Hmm.
less. I mean, it's kind of stronger north of Alaska, like around here, and then near Greenland around here, but it just displaces all of this cold air, and you can see there's like one, two, three strong areas of low pressure.
Yeah.
This one is like kind of just a lobe of the polar vortex in and of itself. You can actually, there's a better way to visualize this. Just kind of looking at, instead of like the height lines themselves, or just, you could just kind of look at this. So you can actually see here all of these blues. Really, I think we can head back and see how compact it is. But yeah, yeah, exactly. So this here, all these kind of whites and purples are the polar vortex. That's pretty much where it is. It's settled right over the pole. But as we head further into time, you can see how it just kind of ends up becoming a lot more kind of disturbed and stretched. And it actually gets like completely displaced and warped. And
Mm,
that's how you like it really ends up like over here. It goes from like here, and it just gets completely squashed by that big high. So that's why the highs are important too, those big blocks, because they end up displacing the polar vortex. You could also see how it gets displaced out here.
hmm.
So instead of going from one compact feature, when it's weak, it's able to, get colder air farther south because it's spreading into all these lobes.
Gotcha. Yeah, and you can obviously, see how that's progressing.
Mhm.
So, we have the good pattern, we have disruption of the polar vortex here. So Kyle, I mean, let's talk. I mean, everybody wants to know when there's a big storm potential, when that could happen. We're kind of getting in that range where we can give ourselves a little bit of a time frame of
Mhm.
where we expect that to happen. So when will it be most favorable?
Yeah. So this is probably something else that's somewhat counterintuitive. But ironically, the the time frame where you do get those large storms is not actually when the block is the strongest. It's actually when it's weakening.
Hmm.
So right now, this is around the 20th. You could see how these reds are, like it's really popping out.
Over
Like
Greenland. Yep.
yeah. So this is a very, very strong block. But the polar vortex is really, you can see it outlined. It's really like right over here. So it's really difficult to actually get a very strong storm because, I mean, even if you do get some moisture that's running up into it, it's really not going to go anywhere. It's difficult to amplify something. But what'll happen is that you'll see the block generally weaken, which again, you might think, oh, that's not great. Like, don't you want it to be strong? But when it weakens, you could see how the polar vortex, a lot of that colder air, it starts to kind of lessen a little bit. The flow becomes a lot less compressed, so you're able to kind of push things into it. And along with that, what's also kind of worth noting is that you also in the Pacific, you have this very strong low here that's forcing a lot of air, just kind of this by the way isn't the same as what was happening in December, and what's happening now because there is that blocking. So this actually is able to provide moisture. A lot of people might think, oh, the Pacific jet is just kind of roaring, but it's not
Hmm.
exactly the same. But so what that'll do is that that'll actually back up a little bit. So you can watch as we move forward in time, that low pressure starts to retreat more towards the Aleutian Islands. And instead, it's replaced with this nice ridge that's starting to pop up along the west coast. So you have the block that's starting to weaken. You have the ridging that's starting to pop up along the west coast.
Hmm.
And if you follow here, if you look along the east coast, you could see how you have these, like right along like the coast of the Carolinas. As you head towards the 20th, 21st, 22nd, you can see how there's a bit of a signal here for low pressure to strengthen. So
Yeah.
all of that really kind of tracks. Like a lot of the time, with those uh, slow moving, decaying blocks. You could think of examples like March of 2018. There was February of 2021. I mean, there was even last March. I know a lot of people along the coast didn't get a ton of snow from that, but that was a really extreme storm in some parts of New England. I know some parts of like the hills near Worcester got like 2 feet of snow from that. That was another block that was retrograding and decaying. So I would say probably between like really, like, I'd say maybe, like, the 22nd to 25th, 26th is when you get that block weakening, and you get a little bit of high pressure along the West Coast, and that's when you're able to actually get a storm to really strengthen.
All right. Well, there you have it. Towards the end of the month, it looks like we're going to be potentially dealing with a larger storm. But again, we need those individual storm pieces to come into alignment, I should
Yeah,
say.
yeah,
And that's always the trick of these things. But it's step one is having a great pattern in
mhm,
place to see a big snowstorm, and that's what we're seeing from what Kyle has explained
yeah,
as we head towards later in the month. Now, we still have some snow potential heading into March too.
yeah, I think so. So, just looking at the pattern again, so this is the 25th. So, you could see again how that block, up towards Greenland, it gets quite a bit weaker.
Hmm.
But you can almost see it trying to kind of, ebb and flow and reload a little bit. So like this block is actually very stable. It remains there for quite a long time. Like this is into March 8th at this point. So this is, end of the first week, second week of March. And this low pressure near the Aleutian Islands remains there.
Mm,
And it's quite a bit weaker. So you also don't run the risk of any Pacific jet kind of overwhelming the pattern. You have a nice high kind of staying along the west coast, just a broad trough in the east. Um, and
right.
this yeah, so, like, a lot of the time, like, I might not be so inclined to believe this, if the polar vortex wasn't so weak, but it is. So it's definitely something plausible. I would honestly even go as far to say that when that blocking does reload, you probably do have another window for a larger storm sometime in early March, like, probably, like, around the end of the first week, somewhere in there. Wouldn't be surprising at all.
Hmm,
So I think that's also, historically speaking, a pretty decent time, early March for like some larger storms, just generally. So
right.
it's certainly a possibility, but I don't think it's going to be a one and done. So like even if you do miss out on that first window, there's probably going to be another opportunity or two. Like it's not, you don't just have one crack at it.
Right. Well, that's good to hear. And I know this is setting up to some of the analogs that you've been looking at too,
Yeah.
where it does look similar to years when there has been a bigger storm or two.
Hmm. Yeah, totally. That's probably one of the ways that one of the ways that we even know that those larger blocks that are decaying even produce storms is just by looking at what's happened in the past, and
Hmm.
that's definitely one of the main features. So just kind of zooming out a little bit to the rest of the northern hemisphere, um, and then looking at just kind of like the 30-day average. So this is from one sec. There we go. So this is from like mid-February through mid-March. So the main features of the pattern here that we're looking at, you have this big Aleutian low, you have a nice broad trough that's centered kind of over that 50-50 region that Mike was talking
Hmm.
about, and you have a nice high over Greenland. This is a very strong high for like a 30-day mean. That's very impressive. And you have a nice high that's poking into Alaska. So like the main flow is generally something like this along these lines, something like that, and then you also have this nice subtropical jet that's very active.
Hmm.
So this is a very good look for really just cold and active rather than just cold. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind, and then we'll kind of look at some other years. So this was 1958. This was, I think, Mike, we were considering this one, but it was too old to include with the temps because you
Right.
don't want to skew them too low. Um, but again, you have the same kind of deal. You have that big low near the
Right.
Aleutians. You have another low along along the Atlantic. You have a nice high in Greenland. You have a nice high in Alaska. So at 1958, this was around the time when this produced one major storm in late February. There was another storm in late March.
Hmm.
Um, this is um, this is 2016, so this is mid to late January of 2016. Again, very similar. Aleutian low, large trough. Arctic is very blocked up.
Yeah.
2016 was, of course, the January 16 blizzard. Um, and then this was early February of 2010. So again, the blocking is a bit more focused into Greenland. It is very, very, very strong. I don't think the blocking is going to get quite as strong as this, but honestly,
Right.
you can't exactly preclude it. Some of the blocking showing up, like on some of the guidance, is actually this strong. Um, and 2010 is one of those analogs that makes the hair on some people's necks stand up a little bit.
Yeah.
You can't exactly expect anything like that because that was
Right.
record breaking.
Sure.
But again, you have a lot of the same features. You have that same Pacific trough, you have the Atlantic
Yeah.
trough, you have the strong blocking. So it's like, so, the,
All of the maps that he's showing is
and then you look back
are
and
very similar to what the pattern looks like on some long range modeling.
yeah,
So it's one of those time periods where you can be a bit more confident on seeing a major storm or two within this window from late February into early to mid March maybe. So
yeah,
um, it definitely looks like things are changing here. That's for sure.
yeah.
Kyle, I think after mid March, things pretty much relax, is what I think you were talking about earlier before we started this, right?
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, like, at a certain point, that blocking is going to dissipate.
Mm-hmm.
We were actually thinking that March was going to be quite a warm month.
Mm,
But one of the other things that was in the back of our mind too was it's definitely possible that February could be quite blocky. So when you do have that blocking, it likes to linger. So,
yep.
but like on the whole, with El Ninos, especially stronger ones, yeah, March is generally quite toasty. I could see the like last 10 days of March being quite warm. And then if you look towards April, these are years that are comparable to this one. So you have like 2010, you have 1973, 2003, 2016. It's generally quite warm. I mean,
Yep.
the Pacific Jet usually is quite active during these times. We're also going to be transitioning into a La Nina probably. The forecasts aren't particularly reliable at this point in time, but there's pretty high confidence on it. A lot of the time, La Ninas, they're quite warm, especially, like in the summer. They're known for their warm summers generally. So once we get into April, I don't see why it wouldn't be quite warm. I mean, especially in the northern tier of the country in the Midwest, there really isn't that much evidence to the contrary, for sure. And it would definitely obey Climo as well. So
Mhm.
I don't see a reason why. I don't really see a reason why blocking would stick around for that long as to like ruin April or anything like that. Because I know that's happened over the last few years. I don't really see it.
All right, Kyle. Well, I think that pretty much sums everything up for us. And I really do appreciate you, being on the video here with us today in the podcast, talking about what can happen here towards the end of the winter season. There you have it, guys. So, heading into mid to late February, into early to mid March, looks like it's going to be more opportunities for snowstorms and possibly a bigger snowstorm. So, Kyle, thanks a lot here for being on the Weather Lounge with us, and giving us the rundown.
Yeah, of course.
All right. And remember, we'll have a new episode of our podcast every 2 weeks. So please visit us on all those apps where you listen. And also visit weatherworksinc.com. That's where our parent company, WeatherWorks, is located to learn about what they do in the snow and ice industry and in the forecast realm of things. And also be sure to rate the show. It always helps to push the show forward and to get more weather enthusiasts to find our show. So thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll be with you soon.